Welcome. We are back here at Funding the Commons and Earth Commons in Berkeley. This is all part of Protocol Labs Lab Week for Public Goods. Our guests today, Samantha Power from Finance for Gaia and Stuart Cowan from Buckminster Fuller Institute. Thank you both for taking the time to sit down.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And maybe just as a matter of initial introductions, can you share a bit about who you are and what you're up to, Sam?
Sure. I am Samantha Power. I am a regenerative economist, a futurist, a bioregionalist, and the founder of a consulting firm called Finance for Gaia that is working to put finance in service to life.
Beautiful. And Stuart?
I'm Stuart Cowan. I'm the executive director of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and I am a systems scientist. I'm an ecological designer, regenerative economist, and have been working on what we used to call sustainability, and then we called it resilience and regeneration and thriving, and trying to do what I can.
Nice. And Stuart, I've known BFI for a number of years, and you've just come into the position a couple of years ago, was it?
Yeah, even just a year and a half at this point.
Year and a half.
Yeah.
And so how have you thought about the mantle that you are carrying and the organization's priorities and just broad strokes on BFI?
Well, it's an incredible legacy because Buckminster Fuller Institute was literally started in the last years of Bucky's life. Mm-hmm. It was something very important to him to carry on this legacy of really working on behalf of Spaceship Earth, of planetary thriving, that we all could play an integral role. We could find our deepest capacity to serve the whole and not wait to find someone that might employ us in that role or know exactly how to do it, but just begin doing the work. Mm-hmm. So he really wanted BFI to be a place that would inspire people year after year to work systemically. He called it comprehensive anticipatory design science. So that sense of whole systems, long time periods, interdisciplinary, science, art, creativity, all wrapped into design on behalf of whole systems. And at 40, we have this amazing legacy as a nonprofit. Very few nonprofits make it to 40. Very few for-profits make it to 40. Mm-hmm. We just had a blowout party a few months ago in San Francisco to celebrate the 40th. And I feel like the mission is more relevant than ever. And it gets reinterpreted year after year. The world has changed beyond recognition. Bucky would have loved every moment of this journey. The fact that things do constantly transform. He would have been saddened that we didn't do the comprehensive planning that we needed to long ago to avert the catastrophes that he foresaw 100 years ago. He would have been very disappointed, but he would have been very pleased that there's endless innovation, endless attempts now to try things that might let the planet thrive.
Bucky was a bit of a hometown hero. I grew up outside of a small town near Carbondale, which is where Southern Illinois University, which I think was one of his professorships on the spice route.
That was a very important place for him for a long time. And then he drifted more towards California towards the end of his life.
Yeah, my dad was a huge Bucky fan. And growing up, I just had that influence early on as well. So wonderful that you're, supporting that legacy and continuing on. And congratulations to the whole organization and all the people who've been a part of it for 40 years. That's very impressive. Samantha, a lot of this conversation and why the two of you, are together is this framing around bioregionalism. And you gave an amazing talk yesterday about the paper that you've been working on. So we'd love to maybe frame that at a high level and also just how you both define these terms, bioregional, and some of the nomenclature around it.
Sure. Yeah, I met Stuart shortly after he took over as ED of BFI, I think just 1 month. And I was already thinking about doing some research on what I'm now calling bioregional financing facilities. And in our first meeting, Stuart said, let's start having conversations about this. at this coffee shop every Friday is what we said. And we haven't kept it to every Friday, but a lot of Fridays we've been hosting regenerative salons at a cafe just down the street in Berkeley, and inviting many of the regenerati from the Bay Area to come join us to envision how we might apply Bucky's teachings to the problems that we're seeing in the world today, and the possibilities that our hearts are feeling into. And so one of these possibilities that my heart has been dreaming of for a long time is building new financial institutions that, as I've said, can put finance in service to life. And I spoke in my talk yesterday about the long journey I've been on, asking the question of how we change where money is flowing so that it may support life. And this has been a question that's been driving me since I graduated from college and fell in love with the rainforest in Southeast Asia and saw the ways that capitalism was destroying that place and the intelligence there. And it took me to DC, to policy school, the US Treasury Department, the World Bank, and eventually it took me here to the Bay Area, where I started finance for Gaia, started collaborating with amazing friends like Stuart, and found bioregionalism, which I have to say is so refreshing after trying to drive change from the top down, trying to change where money is flowing, from places like the G20 or coalitions of central banks and finance ministries. Bioregionalism is really about governing in a place-based way and paying attention to what my friend Brendan Letzinger refers to as hard lines, soft lines, and human lines. So hard lines being geological lines, soft lines being ecological lines, watersheds and vegetation and animal and insect migration, and human lines being cultural lines. Where did indigenous peoples live? What were the languages that they were speaking, and over what territory? How is culture interacting with the landscape today? And so you start there as your kind of building blocks for determining an area that makes sense according to those lines. And then you start organizing people in that place, and you start mapping all of the regenerative initiatives and organizations in that place. And for me, the bioregional movement is about then bringing those initiatives and organizations together in a way that, Stuart has described as anticipatory, comprehensive, is really using a design lens to envision into what do we want this place to look like? What do we want this place to feel like 100 years from now? And then you develop what Stuart and I refer to as a bioregional regeneration strategy. That is, a manifesto, a vision, a path to transitioning out of an economy that is rooted in extraction and destruction to one that is rooted in regenerating life at every level. And bioregional financing facilities are institutions that I've been designing that I believe can support that transition.
Well, so many more questions and provocations from that, but maybe starting, Stuart, again at a high level, Stuart, like how do you think about bioregions, and how does this intersect with the work at BFI?
Well, you articulated this beautifully, Samantha. For BFI, we're working in the tradition of what Fuller called the world game. So back in the mid-1960s, at a time when Rand Corp and others were developing war games, simulating conflict, Bucky said we need to focus on peaceful visualization, scenario building, ways that we could work together, share resources. He believed that there was planetary abundance if we worked together. And in fact, 100 years ago, Fuller proposed a global renewable energy connected grid that would run on wind and solar and be near free. So he was an early commons thinker as well, and a radical regenerative finance thinker. So bioregion is just a way to evoke connection to the world, to life, to place. And so a bioregion is both cultural and physical. Sometimes watershed boundaries, and a watershed is just where all of the water flows to the same place. Nothing fancy. So if you just trace a river going out into the ocean, okay, everything that goes into that river is a watershed. That's a beautiful way to connect to place. But then there are linguistic groups. There are mountain ranges. There are wonderful assemblages of species that start to vary. So when you do a watershed-based map, it's not going to map exactly onto linguistic maps. It's not going to map onto species, ecosystem maps. So it's just sort of this wonderful playfulness. And you can have multiple overlapping bioregions. It doesn't have to be a new Westphalian nation-state map of the world. It can actually be soft and overlapping, like indigenous territories overlapped. So we've seen some wonderful mapping trying to reconstruct, for instance, here on Turtle Island, where were the traditional territories? And they overlapped in all kinds of ways. So it's not saying it's just a different sort of scale that's a little more life-centered and then you have this rigid set of boundaries. It's just an invitation to actually infinite diversity of the ways we connect with life. So bioregion, some people call it landscapes. So our colleagues at 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people feel like that's the best, sort of most neutral way to talk about it, a large landscape just being a large unit of land that has some coherence and integrity. Watershed, there are watershed councils. So New Zealand, Aotearoa has a watershed governance system, as you probably well know. I think there are 12 watershed councils or something. Oregon has a lovely sort of watershed organization system. So I'll make this a little paradoxical. So we might think we're going from these huge nation states. So like in the United States, going down to a bioregional scale is fantastic because it's very hard to govern this vast, conflicted nation. So the idea that you could have lots of much smaller areas that start to have their own governance and integrity is very helpful. So it's kind of decentralization. But at the same time, we actually need to go up in scale. So we have a very contrarian, fascinating colleague named Indy Johar at Dark Matter Labs. And Indy has developed, along with Royal Melbourne Institute for Technology, something called planetary civics. And BFI is getting involved in this craziness as well. And it's saying not only do we have to have much smaller, decentralized, life-connected ways to have finance flow and to govern, we may need to think about the entire Himalayan mountain range as a living being, as a commons, as an entity that may need a huge amount of public finance to shore up the glaciers there however we can, because 2 billion people depend on the glaciers for drinking water. Or maybe we need a way to understand the migratory pathways of humpback whales, thousands of miles, and support their health all along the way. So we need a new kind of governance. Money needs to flow to that to support the whales. So really we're opening all of this up to anything that's alive on this planet, mountain ranges, migratory pathways, huge watersheds, the atmospheric rivers that flow through the Amazon basin. Those are beings. If those living processes fail, it has planetary consequences. So we almost need an authority that can support the health of those particular atmospheric rivers that flow in from the Atlantic, go through the Mata Atlantica forest, and then evaporate, tree after tree, kind of passing along this water vapor all the way to the base of the Andes, flow south, and then back out towards the Atlantic. We need that. We need money to flow towards that. We need some way to maybe collaborate with the trees, need their representatives, all the species in the basin, the rivers, all of us, however we can have proxy votes. We have to get money flowing to the way the planet works.
I get so excited, because it feels like this more utopian vision of how things could be, and kind of just makes sense at some level. And then another part of me has that skepticism of we have nation states and we have local councils and governments, and it's not like people are going to soften their control of power around all of these rigid boundaries that we currently have easily. And gosh, it just it sounds great, but how would we actually get there? Or what would be a pathway to these types of visions? And Sam, I know you're, quite pragmatic and, also
Sometimes.
Thinking in these lines. And, you said something yesterday that I wrote down in your talk. You said, I'm an institutionalist building institutions for the bioregional economy, which I thought was quite provocative. But yeah, maybe if you can also share a bit of the research you've been doing, the paper that you've been working on, and I'd love to get into some of these more pragmatic details of how do we see this transition actually going?
Yeah, no, I like the question you started out with, Matthew, of how do we transition? These nation states still exist, subnational authorities, urban authorities, rural municipal authorities exist. How do we transition? How do we coexist? And that's a question Stuart and I think a lot about. And initially, I think there will be both. You will have bioregional governance entities start to form that coexist and work with local authorities. Right now in the United States, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which has allocated unlimited, essentially, amounts of capital over many years to climate-related projects, other ecological projects. And that money, as I understand it, is struggling to get to communities doing regenerative projects on the ground. So even the U.S. government is realizing that we need to fund regeneration at a larger scale than we're currently funding it at. And yet the bureaucracy is not working to serve people that are doing some of the most urgent work on the planet, right? Taking care of our lands and waters, building resilience. And I see bioregional financing facilities, which I can tell you more about what that is, being an entity that can help to connect capital that is currently held, by governments, by philanthropists, by financial institutions to the regenerative actions and regenerative organizations that they increasingly are becoming aware of that they need to fund. It's essential to support a stable economy and all of the things that even those traditional institutions are mandated to support. And meanwhile, I think it is kind of a utopia, a sandbox where we can play, where we can envision, where we can think about what's possible. For so many years while I lived in DC, I just felt everyone around me dreaming from a very narrow space, right? Like the bounds of what they allowed themselves to dream was so small, and it felt really constraining to me. And once I started thinking about bioregionalism and building nature states rather than the nation states, it's anything is possible. I was talking to our friend Lawrence Gradeska yesterday, who's working on a Bay Delta Trust, a bioregional governance entity here in the San Francisco Bay. And, he was discussing, we need to be really audacious about, the governance models that we're looking at. And I suggested we have a chat with the Lunar Foundation, who has been working on governance processes for the moon. There's no reason that we shouldn't bring the learnings from working through a moon governance process to governing, places that do have existing governing authorities in place, but we're connecting new people and creating new institutions that can exist alongside the old. So along those lines, I have been doing this research, as you well know, on bioregional financing facilities. I thought it might be like a 30-page paper, but now it's, I think, like 100 and something pages. In order to support the transition, I believe that we have to shift power to regenerators, essentially, to people living in a place-based way and building place-based economies. And I see money as still really central to that right now, because no matter what we're building it within a global capitalist economy. And all of the people doing amazing, beautiful work on the ground still need money for the most part to support their needs. And the movements that I see that are, really developing a critical mass, they're often under-resourced. And so bioregional financing facilities aim to address that. They serve both the decentralization of financial resource governance, putting people living in relationship to place, Indigenous communities, other regenerative leaders in charge of how financial resources in their region are managed. And they also serve as the connective tissue between really centralized financial resources that are kind of stuck right now, stuck in these cycles of having to meet market rate returns. And really, the only way to do that is through some type of extraction or destruction. And communities on the ground, the mycelial web of regenerators, as I call it, that are really under-resourced. And bioregional financing facilities are essentially a new layer in the global financial architecture that serve as the connective tissue between those stuck resources and the under-resourced regenerative projects on the ground. And they can help heal relationships too between finance and regenerators and the places where that money is flowing. And that's a big part of the work, is changing the story around investment and what investors want from providing capital to these projects, and looking not just at financial returns, but ecological, social, inspiration, and broader economic returns, and thinking about how to create a relationship between anyone who's investing in a bioregion and what's happening there.
Stuart, you've been collaborating with Sam and accompanying this journey. What do you make of this paper and this body of work?
Well, I had the honor, really, of working with John Fullerton for 3 years at Capital Institute. And John is a real pioneer in regenerative finance, regenerative economics. So in 2015...
Essentially, he coined the term, right?
Well, Bucky actually used the term regenerative
Is that right?
over and over again by the 1960s.
Right.
And I'd like to track
All roads lead to Bucky.
I'd like to track that down more. I know John himself was deeply influenced by Fuller. And when he started finding these regenerative quotes, he'd call me up, Stuart, Bucky wrote about this decades ago. What's going on? So John wrote a paper on regenerative capitalism in 2015 that was extremely important, very, very influential. I learned an enormous amount from that, inspired me to go work with John, and really work on regenerative bioregions. So that paper is working at a very high level, really looking at very broad principles around regenerative economics. I think this is the most important paper since John's paper in this field, because it's landing it in a place-based setting, much more practical. This can be the core of a transition strategy. So to your question about utopia, we're between stories is one way to think about it. So Thomas Berry was this extraordinary geologian, so a theologian of the earth. And he wrote a beautiful book called The Dream of the Earth that has the single best chapter on bioregionalism. And it's actually about the Hudson Valley. Highly recommended. But for Thomas Berry, as a geologian, he had studied epochs of human history. And he said, we're literally in this much more recent story, just a few hundred years, of detachment, of colonization, patriarchy, all of these things, a disenchantment, an abstraction from the world. But the more ancient story, our deepest home as beings, as human beings, is the 10,000, 100,000-year-old story, that we're connected to all of life. We're connected to a singular 13.8 billion-year-old process that is the universe, and this unfolding, endlessly alive being in its own right. And here we are on this magical planet that took 3 generations of galaxies to birth, because in the first generation, there's not enough diversity of elements to create planets. So it's taken a lot of work of a lot of galaxies and stars to even give us a chance. There's a lot to be grateful for.
Yeah.
So it's the ancient, it's the indigenous connected view. And that's the story that makes us alive, that we're finding a way back to. So we're between stories, and it's just noisy and jittery because there's all this capital tied up in things that are destructive and extractive, and it needs to be restructured, renegotiated. We have to fight dollar by dollar to move these transactions into life-affirming patterning. So bioregional financing facilities are the bridge, because right now they're able to accept very large pools of recognizable national currency money. Yen can arrive, dollars can arrive, right? Deutschmarks can arrive, like euros can arrive, like any kind of currency can arrive at one of these facilities.
Cryptocurrency too, Matthew.
And cryptocurrency, and yes.
That was my next question.
Web3.
Saw it coming.
Yeah. It can arrive and then these, flow in this beautiful way right down to individual land regenerators. So that's an immediate practical thing. But now think about the $20 billion that's being set aside to go flow into biodiversity-related projects, right? There's an agreed pool that's going to go through the Global Environmental Facility, and then nations will compete, and then they'll go to subnational authorities. Like, that's the way this round will probably happen. But imagine if these bioregional financing facilities are stood up, and over time, and I think this can be over 3 to 4 years, almost every bioregion in the world can have some version of this ready to accept even very large pools of money and bring it right down to the ground. And also to regenerative enterprises of various scales and ecosystems of enterprises, but also to individual land stewards and land guardians that desperately need that kind of direct support. So it works right now as a way to take pools of money, whether regenerative investors, right, whether these kinds of global settlements that we're seeing, and bring it right down to the ground. But as we have a global conversation about really who we are as a species and where we want to go and how we're going to get through the massive bottleneck that we're facing, how we're going to truly support thriving systems around the planet. As those conversations happen, I think enormous amounts of capital will be freed up, trillions of dollars, and they will also have a place to land. They can flow through these kinds of facilities. And over time, there'll be other kinds of complementary currencies. So imagine nature-based currencies. Imagine the full force of Web3, eco-credits, all these amazing ways that we can then have more and more alignment with life in an individual bioregion.
Right. So what I'm hearing is you said, Sam, the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, is essentially unlimited, it's over $1 trillion, and you can't put one precise number on it because it's a lot of tax incentives and, grants budgets and different forms of originating a base layer of debt to enable these transitions, especially around things like renewable energy. But a lot of that capital ends up accruing to large-scale corporations, kind of institutions that know how to play the game of top-down, centralized, armies of lawyers. And, it's not the local communities necessarily that are actually getting those flows of funds, or they're only getting a small portion by the time it all trickles down. And so what you're proposing is that bioregional financing facilities, BFFs, greatest acronym ever, easiest to remember.
Every bioregion needs a BFF.
every bioregion needs a BFF. You're killing it with the new languaging. I love it. And yeah, so like what are the kinds of examples of these institutions at a bioregional scale? Can you kind of help make it even more concrete of what these types of organizational structures and funds might look like? And just to complete that thought, so that, essentially what you're saying is, as these large pools of capital are from Kunming-Montreal Agreement around biodiversity and commitments of countries to invest more in nature, that we have water catchments to essentially capture these large pools of funds and make sure that it's effectively flowing into local communities.
Yeah, so one of the key kind of attributes of bioregional financing facilities is that they play an aggregation and matchmaking role. So we need the regenerators to be doing their work of regeneration, not applying to grants and, doing all kinds of complex MRV, but focusing on their work. And essentially, the bioregional financing facilities would aggregate the capital, an integrated capital portfolio, most likely. And the
can you just define what that is? What's an integrated capital portfolio?
Philanthropic grant capital, public grant capital, and investment capital.
Great.
Yep. So they would aggregate the capital. They would also aggregate projects. They would also develop an MRV platform, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So each project isn't having to do their own monitoring, reporting, and verification, but there is a centralized, decentralized entity, but somewhat centralized in the bioregion that is doing that for them. So is connecting to, the bureaucracy to access the IRA capital, for example. And there are 4 templates for bioregional financing facilities that I lay out in the paper. The first is a bioregional trust. This is arguably the most important bioregional financing facility in my view, and also should come first. And that would be, it's essentially a catalytic grant fund. So it would be capitalized through public and philanthropic grants. It could also set up a common asset trust. So it could hold a watershed or a mountain range or a species in a commons and determine who should be paying into that commons for taking out of it and who should be getting paid for doing actions of regeneration. That entity could also support people in the bioregion to develop a methodology for eco-credits. I know you've interviewed the folks from Regen Network on the platform before, so I encourage your viewers and listeners to go check out the episodes with Austin and Gregory to learn more about what they're up to. But I really think that there's potential for the Bioregional Trust to support people across the bioregion to develop and issue eco-credits, and then the Bioregional Trust can kind of aggregate them and work with matchmaking with the appropriate buyers. And then it can also just issue grants to projects in the bioregion. All of these, of course, aligned with the Bioregional Regeneration Strategy, which is the guiding document for all bioregional financing facilities that will be created. And that's where kind of the long-term vision and the place-based participatory development of a vision for the bioregion comes through and directs the flow of capital. So after the Bioregional Trust, there is the Bioregional Venture Studio, which would support cohorts of entrepreneurs that want to work on shifting particular systems within the bioregion. So we take a very systemic investing approach in the paper. So, for example, in a particular bioregion, if they want to shift the food system to transition to regenerative agriculture from conventional agriculture, the Bioregional Venture Studio can incubate a cohort of entrepreneurs that are working on that, and each of them would create an entity that creates a holistic ecosystem that can support a robust, thriving, regenerative food economy in that place. The third is a bioregional investment company, and this is where most of the return-seeking capital that would be flowing to bioregional financing facilities would go. And the investment company would develop systemic investing funds. So each fund could have a thematic focus, and there's potential for grant capital or guarantees to support some investment capital coming in. But we are really advocating for investors to look at a holistic portfolio of returns, not just financial returns. And we believe that the returns from these systemic investing portfolios could be quite a lot higher than the returns that impact investors are seeking elsewhere because of the systemic approach to building those portfolios. The last bioregional financing facility is the bioregional bank. The bank can provide low-interest loans to regenerative organizations, technical assistance, very similar to a CDFI or Community Development Financial Institution. CDFIs are doing amazing work all over the United States. And we profile an Indigenous one called Spruce Root that's based in Alaska in the report. Highly recommend reading about what Spruce Root is up to. But something different that the bioregional banks would do is they could issue complementary currencies, community currencies, nature-based currencies, and support the transition in the bioregion to using a currency that reflects what people in the bioregion value. And it could be backed by the health of the salmon population, or I've been talking about a buffalo buck that would be backed by the health of wild, free-roaming buffalo herds. So these sorts of things can back the currency and support a transition away from using kind of global fiat currencies that don't reflect what people in that place actually value. So those are the four. And we aren't too prescriptive on where bioregions start. The trust, I think, can fund a lot of the organizing and activation that needs to happen in the bioregion at an early stage. But from there, whatever a bioregion wants to prioritize, they can choose to start a bioregional financing facility focused on that. And the trust could support the setting up of the other bioregional financing facilities.
And that framework of these four types of BFFs, is it fair to say that those are kind of soft lines and it may look different depending on the local context and the jurisdiction?
Definitely. And in some places, we might be building these from the ground up. In other places, there might be an existing financial institution that we just make some adjustments to so that it becomes a BFF.
Right. You know what I appreciate about the way that this paper is starting to affect my thinking is, so, you know, I help Stuart a trust called Biome Trust. And so we obviously have resonance with a lot of these ideas. And we think at a bioregional scale of where we're placed in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And yeah, we already do some of these things in certain ways at a tiny scale, but, you know, around grant making and, you know, we're exploring the lending models using the endowment capital. But like having a reference guide that helps to synthesize the research and the work of other projects. And, you know, it's not a prescription. It's not even necessarily an exact recipe book, but it just kind of brings specificity and structure and reference to, like helping us find our way and then find other projects that could be, you know, good allies in this to experiment and learn from each other and so forth. So yeah, that's one way I'm already experiencing this. And the paper is still in final draft form. It hasn't been released yet. Is that correct?
It should be out next month. Thank you for that reflection, Matthew. I think it's exactly that. It's, as I said, quite long, so I don't expect people to read it cover to cover, but I think it will be a really good reference guide. And depending on where capital stewards or bioregional organizing teams or designers, economists are working at, they can flip to that part of the paper and read about that specific recommendation or vision.
I can't wait for the printed copy. It's going to be like you come to my coffee table and there's like Salvador Dali art book and then BFFs, finance discussion.
That's
Take your pick.
That's the dream.
Well, something really powerful about the idea of a bioregional financing facility is it's highly contextual. So you're not just dropping in a fund like literally happens. A few people set up shop in a country and suddenly they're, making private equity investments or whatever it happens to be.
Right.
The whole premise of this work is it's a whole ecosystem of activity. So you're sensing the region in these amazing ways. Everything from satellite imagery refreshed daily by our friends at Planet Labs to bioacoustic monitoring, to eDNA, taking amazing samples, soil biome, whatever it is. And you're getting this amazing integrated picture of the region, also trued up with indigenous knowledge, indigenous guardians understanding, their place and logging, new data on that. And then you're going through to this cycle of, well, what is the vision for a bioregion? And that's part of why BFI is so excited, because Bucky always said, well, build a scenario, make a game out of it, like create some way for people to connect and have positive, vibrant visions, strategies for where they might go. And a bioregional regeneration strategy nested within maybe multiple bioregions, nested within a continental, nested within a planetary strategy, all playing off of each other. You need that context to have directionality for a bioregional financing facility. And then it's systemic investing too, which is a fairly new approach the last 3 or 4 years. Dominic Hofstetter has been a key person with TransCap Initiative. I was just at their first conference at MIT in January. Phenomenal work. So they're taking the best of systems thinking and saying we can do impact investing, regenerative investing through that lens of how do you transform a whole system. Then connect that to place, and you have a chance to really understand the acupuncture points for a given region, and maybe relatively modest key investments made in the right way, in a non-extractive way, can bring life and flow to a region. And then you're truly primed once you've mapped regenerators and even set up what we're calling bioregional hubs or bioregional learning centers, places, physical places where you're sense-making, you're gathering together, you're understanding everything in the region. Maybe you're getting services like being able to have support for a grant application or accessing government funds. A lot of just community gathering and celebrating place. And you can have lots of those hubs in every bioregion. And then you're truly primed, right, to have these kinds of amazing institutions that Samantha's talking about. And we should also add that all of this ideally is a co-design process with indigenous communities. So part of the larger context of how we build all the supportive capacity to eventually get to regenerative finance, all that resilience, regeneration capacity, it's going to be this profound partnership that should be led with indigenous worldview and context and direction, like moving towards relationality, reconnection, rematriation, right? That has to be the context if we're going to have any way through. And the beautiful thing is that's joyful. Like if that's just what we choose. So back to your question about, yes, utopian, maybe not. Maybe it's just really pragmatic. Maybe it's just going to the wisdom keepers and saying, well, what did you do when there was enormous climate change in Australia, 3,000 years ago? And you can get a very precise set of answers. And like, oh, like we've been through this as a species. Different large regions have gone through all kinds of changes. There are ancient protocols for this.
Right.
So rather than maybe utopian framing, it's just really pragmatic. Let's just go to the wisdom holders, the 400 million or so extraordinary indigenous people, 5% of the population, 20% of the land, and 80% of biodiversity. that they steward. So everything that we're trying to do is this co-design process, and it's messy. Everyone's trying to understand good protocols to do this, even protocols for indigenous nations to work with each other. That's complicated enough. And I'm seeing the messiness as a creative flow now. It used to be just really fraught and difficult and traumatic, frankly. But it's starting to just be kind of messy and kind of creative and kind of fun. And so we work very closely with the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab, extraordinary group led by Tyson Yukaporta, Australian Aboriginal traditional custodians of land who are also bridge academics. And so it's part of a broader effort that we're calling the Planetary Regeneration Alliance. Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab, Samantha's company, BFI, Open Future Coalition, One Earth, 9 organizations working together to support bioregional financing facilities, to support bioregional planning, to support bioregional hubs, the infrastructure to support individual regenerators, and then all of that amazing kind of sensing to just be able to build visions and scenarios, and all the way from ancient ways of just walking the land and observing, well, what's the water like today? What are the ants telling us today? All the way to, we have a fleet of 250 satellites that Planet Labs updates all the time. And we can have a bioregional portal. Imagine like layer after layer of amazing contextualized data, ancient and Western science-based, allowing everybody in the region eventually to sort of mark up a shared scenario for where they want to go.
Right. Yeah, it's exciting. I love listening to you, Stuart, because then I get to also occupy the position of the skeptic and kind of like, yeah, okay, that's all great. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the premise that you had started with, Sam, was that a lot of the projects that need the funding, that are doing on the ground work, we don't want them buried in grant applications and, trying to somehow get IRA money. Like, how are those things connecting? And, I've gone to our local council meetings in New Zealand, and it's arguably just as administrative and bureaucratic as national government types of meetings, right? Like, it feels impenetrable, kind of old school. I love my council. Thank you, council. But the culture is still very much of those ways and that legal system and that financing system. And so, are we just swapping out, pipes and calling it different things or reviving different words and nomenclature, but is it really structurally that different? I mean, how does this really bring agency into the local community?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Matthew. The first attribute of a bioregional financing facility is that it invests according to living systems principles and Indigenous wisdom. So I think that differentiates it from local councils and other types of bureaucracy. And we don't know how this is going to look until we do it. I have not yet designed and built and implemented a bioregional financing facility, but that's the next phase of this work. Actually, now that the paper is getting ready to come out, I'm launching an initiative called the BioFi Project. BFI is a close partner and our fiscal sponsor. Edward West is my co-founder in that project. And
BioFi being bioregional finance.
Bioregional finance. Yeah,
great.
We're going to make it a thing. BioFi is going to hopefully spread around the world. And this one project, the BioFi Project, will bring together a team of experts that have read the paper, at least, if not written parts of the paper, and are ready to work with bioregional organizing teams, with Indigenous communities, to sit down, to start to design, build, raise capital for, figure out how we're allocating capital to projects for these bioregional financing facilities. So we're moving into that phase pretty quickly. And I think I'll have more answers for you then on how do we build institutions that are truly serving the bioregional movement. The paper is, kind of a call to action, a provocation, a guide somewhat, but it's really going to come through applying it and through practice that we learn what that looks like on the ground. And the BioFi project will also be funding a community of practice that will be on high-low, and we're currently finding a community manager that will steward that community of practice. But that's a place where anyone that wants to work on bioregional financing facilities can come together to share challenges and questions and ideas and tools and learn. We're planning to build some software modules to support bioregional financing facilities. The first one we want to build will be focused on bioregional tithing, so people can start paying taxes to their bioregions to support regenerative projects in that place. And the software module will also have kind of a participatory allocation module to support how that funding flows. And we're looking at voting or quadratic funding, which I know is something that you've been playing with Biome Trust as well. So I think the potential for prototyping and innovation is endless. And I think my overall answer to your question is we have to see.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to experiment and take action and learn. And
yeah, I love that question. How will it be any different than my incredibly boring, contentious local council meeting?
Amazing local council. Yes.
Well, part of it is just this framing of what if you have this nested participatory democracy. And the question is, how can we thrive with all the life here, right? All the species, the rivers, all the living processes. How do we do that in a federated way with bioregions all over the world? How do we do that at continental scale? That is the bright, vibrant set of questions to have a good, long discussion around. And so, yeah, it's going to be incredibly messy. I love that. We need the messiness and just the genuine, wow, we could build a way through this together. We could dream our way into a thriving bioregion. And we're talking to our bioregional neighbors they want to do it totally differently. Oh, that's great. Good. That's your pathway. You're kind of higher tech. As our friend Bobby Fishkin would say, a solar punkified future, right? Okay. And another bioregion might want to do very deep energy descent. These are incredibly important practical questions. One region may say, we're all about lifestyle changes. Fantastic. They have a lot of social capital. Maybe there's just a tradition there of really using, appropriate technology, having deep relationships with the land. We're we're just going to cut our energy use by 50%. We go solar, wind like that, and some battery. We're good. The next door region's we kind of like our Teslas. We kind of like some tech. We're going to be higher tech. And that's okay. All that I hope for is that every region in the world starts to really ask the right questions, and then you sort of have an investment portfolio based on that. Here's our regenerative strategy. Here's a price tag. X amount is commercial, no problem. It's green climate bonds, good, no problem. That's great. Anything the market can do, fantastic. But the market cannot do a lot of this, especially around biodiversity. It's much better for things like energy and infrastructure, buildings. Okay, But the moment conventional finance wrestles with biodiversity, for instance, and wants to maybe get certain types of returns, things could go very sideways, and they already are, with carbon markets and loss of indigenous sovereignty in some of those early carbon deals. So we need to ask these amazing questions. How are we going to thrive with our land and waters and species? What will our economy look like? And so when we talk about bioregional financing facilities, it is not kind of an interesting boutique part of the economy. It's not like that 2% that a family office wants to use towards something cool and impact, and 98% is conventional. This is the world. This is the entire economy. This is how we govern ourselves. And if you know how you want to govern yourself as a region and develop a coherent way forward, you can finance that. And finance should only flow to the things that are life-affirming. So it is 100% of the economy.
And we've mentioned some of the names of inspirations and some of the lineage of this work, but there's also been just movements of people and many different, researchers, authors, practitioners, in this kind of bioregional movement that far predates this conversation. I'm curious, what's different now, or what trends are you seeing lately? And any kind of commentary on the current zeitgeist?
And just first to recognize all of the people that contributed to the paper. My co-author, Leanne Seafield from Dark Matter Labs, some other amazing advisors from Dark Matter Labs, and from Biome Trust as well, and many, many contributors. I kind of took a crowdsourcing approach to bringing in examples of ways that this is already happening around the world into the paper, and called on experts in so many different fields. So just really want to give gratitude to all of my friends and colleagues that helped me to create this. And in terms of the bioregional movement and what I'm seeing, yes, as you mentioned, Matthew, it was quite active in the 70s and 80s. Planet Drum Foundation, which is based here in the Bay Area, was organizing bioregional congresses here. Way back then, and I saw an agenda for one of their conferences the other day that was in 1980, and they were talking about a lot of the same topics that we're discussing today. And I feel like there is so much energy and momentum behind the movement at this moment. I've been reading Rick Rubin's The Creative Act, A Way of Being, and he on one page says, some ideas find a time, and then they find their way through us. And I feel like bioregionalism is one of those ideas. This is the moment for bioregionalism to be born. We are all seeing the devastating consequences of imperialism, of capitalism, of economies based in extraction and destruction, of this kind of capital supremacy and focus on market rate returns above anything else. And I think a lot of people are feeling quite hopeless, and they're feeling like broader social and ecological collapse is on the horizon. And I feel like bioregionalism offers a path forward outside of our existing, often stuck, polarized political dynamics, outside of, capitalism or degrowth. It's something different entirely. It's building those new institutions that Bucky talked about, and knowing that the old ones will fall in time and be composted into something new. And that is what bioregionalism is aiming to do. And that is what I hope this paper will contribute to, is the composting of old systems and rebirth of an economy that is rooted in mutually assured thriving. Our friend Indy Johar says there are only two paths: mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving. And I am walking as fast as I can towards a path of mutually assured thriving.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, well, I have to ask about Web3 and crypto, because you alluded to it. It is a big part of the conversation here.
Definitely.
Funding the Commons and Earth Commons, Protocol Labs, obviously having a lot of its origins in the crypto space. And a lot of resonance, I think, around the bioregional conversation, the decentralization conversation.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of overlap and synergies here. What are you making of that and this space, and any other comments from either of you on this?
Yeah, Should I go first, Stuart?
Sure.
Okay. So there are two ways that that Web3 technologies are identified as supporting bioregional financing facilities in the paper. The first is eco-credits, and I talked a little bit about the Bioregional Trust kind of aggregating this portfolio of eco-credits. There's a case study on Regen Network, and of course they use Web3 to track the issuance of their credits, and it enables a very decentralized kind of bottom-up approach to developing methodology. So I think that's really critical to support bioregions. And then the second is around creating these complementary or nature-based currencies. I had an amazing conversation with John Clippinger the other night, who's here, who's been looking at active inference and how active inference can support the design of nature-based currencies. Our friend Martine Weinstein is also working on this. So I'm really excited to hopefully form a pilot project with John and Martine and the BioFi team and BFI to start to design a nature-based currency as part of a bioregional bank and start to play with that as a way to shift how we view value in the bioregion.
Great.
Yeah, the beautiful thing about Web3 is you can connect value to active flows. Things can be moving, things can be incredibly diverse geographically. So it's not just one fiat currency that happens to be tied to national boundaries. You can create currencies tied to bioregional boundaries that can be moving in time. You can have these eco-credits. You can take eco-credits and maybe have a basket of them that becomes your bioregional currency. Your bioregional bank eventually can be like a central bank for the bioregion. And what if you had a bunch of central banks of bioregions in solidarity all over the world? At some point, the kind of Bretton Woods global financial architecture gets less interesting. Like the way that this might practically unfold is just we have this kind of governance and financial flow to things that connect with life, bioregional scale, Himalayas, whatever these entities are. And that's where people are like, that's actually allowing us to thrive and the world to thrive. Gradually, money will move, governance will move in that direction. And everything that's extractive and disembodied will just be uninteresting eventually, right? So Web3 enables us to do these incredibly flexible experiments geographically and even communities that are dispersed in interesting ways but share an affinity for some sort of commons. So some people are calling that myco-fi. So BioFi and myco-fi unstoppable. I mean, myco-fi is this brand new idea of sort of mycelial finance and co-finance. And just think of a mycelial network. And I highly recommend everyone look at like the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, which is mapping these huge mycorrhizal networks all over the world that stretch for hundreds of miles. Look at their videos of what these networks do at like 40 miles an hour in these underground networks, exchanging nutrients and nourishing the whole. Like that's what we can do. myco-fi, Web3, BioFi, all of that, but always with co-design with an indigenous view as well. Keep it connected to life. There are infinite pathways where we could thrive as a planet. And so to bring it back to BFI for a moment, so a lot of our work is through what we call the BFI Design Lab. And basically, we're trying to identify critical interventions for planetary thriving. So what are some of those key things that will help us flourish? Water, soil, and so forth. And it's extraordinary that we have this bioregional finance facility work that might give us a way to almost solve the financial intervention. And then, so that's a lab project. And then the Planetary Regeneration Alliance is a lab project and trying to look at how to support systemically bioregional resilience and regeneration. So that becomes a lab project. We're working on an Indigenous rewilding network as another keystone project. We're working with Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab to try to support these labs all over the world. And they might be co-located with bioregional hubs and have financing mechanisms through bioregional financing facility. So all of this is starting to actually interconnect in beautiful ways. And our role at the lab is just to be a huge, supporter first and foremost, almost to just validate it and say, yes, it's incredibly audacious. Mm-hmm. It's the right thing to try, and it could just succeed. It really could. It has a chance, and let's resource it. We're starting to sort of give mini grants early on. We can do fiscal sponsorships. We bring that design science perspective. And Samantha's played a huge role in really helping shape the first year of the BFI Design Lab, like everything that we're doing. So all of this work has interconnected organically and is now its own mycelium. I get the most fun inbound calls you can imagine. Like, Panama Canal is not working very well because there's not enough water. Can we restore the Amazon basin and Panama's rainforests? Okay, let's develop a project around that. I'm all in. Like, literally, these are the calls that we get. And these kinds of audacious things are happening all over the world. We ran the Buckminster Fuller Challenge for 10 years. From 2007 to 2017. We got a 10-year grant to do that. It was amazing. And we surfaced dozens of projects every year. And those were sort of individual companies, typically, or nonprofits doing amazing things. So we're very much in that spirit, and we're just saying, what if it's a whole innovation system? Like, what if it's a whole new field that needs to be built around this? Let's play, let's create. And that's a fun journey to be on.
Super exciting. Appreciate both of you so much for the work. I feel like if we look to the patterns of life, that we could trust that. And, I love the spirit of experimentation and getting out there and doing things and holding these beautiful visions of what's possible and leaning into the creative, imaginative acts the way you both are. So, yeah, thank you. Much respect. Samantha, you shared the quote from Bucky yesterday on stage. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you build a new model that makes the old one obsolete. You're both embodying that very much in the work. We'll put links in the show notes to all of the resources mentioned. I do want to give a huge shout out to Protocol Labs, Funding the Commons, Earth Commons. There's a lot of exciting conversations happening here. This is day 2. Check out our other conversations. So far, we had Atosa Saltani and Gregory Landaway talking about eco-credits and the Jaguar Biocultural Credits pilot project. Atosa referred to the Bioregional Life Plan that is happening in the Sacred Headwaters region of the Amazon rainforest. So very much resonant with these themes. We had a conversation around Gitcoin Grants Round 20, which Ma Earth is also participating in. We heard from the Climate Coordination Network, Gitcoin, and Open Civics around how this embrace of financing facilities at local levels. Benjamin mentioned, even the idea that one day our taxes will just go into one of these types of BFFs that might be quadratically distributed through different forms of value into bioregions. We had a conversation around the hoodie economics. The first time I've ever interviewed a puppet. The Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab came up in that conversation as well. And we're going to be continuing to have many more conversations here. So check out the channel, check out Funding the Commons, Earth Commons, Protocol Labs, Public Goods Week, and one more shill just because I have to make sure to also share. We have a lot of great conversations on maearth.com and our channel with many of the names that were mentioned. I started to write them down because there were so many. Martine from Open Earth Foundation, Tibet from Hilo. We've talked to Regen Foundation, Austin Wade Smith. We have Caitlin from Open Future Coalition, the Gitcoin crew with Kevin Owaki, Atosa and Gregory, as I mentioned, One Earth, Justin Winters, and the bioregional mapping that they're doing. So lots of great nuanced, long-form conversations as well as short clips on all of our channels. Find more at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.